Strategies for Change, The History of Disability with Damien Walshe and Fiona Weldon.
So myself and Fiona are co-presenting tonight. We're looking at the history of disability and the history of how disabled people have been treated by society. I'm going to focus on from about the 17th century, so about 400 years ago, up to the 20th century. And Fiona is going to look at the 20th and 21st century, specifically in Ireland. So obviously we're going to try and cover about 400 years in an hour and a little bit. So it is very condensed. I'm not going to give you every single piece of information naturally enough, but it's to try and introduce some concepts around thinking around how society is ordered and structured and how specifically that impacts on disabled people's lives now. And the reason we're going to do that is because obviously we're in a program called Strategies for Change, so that we have an understanding of where structures have been built up to think around how those can be changed within the future. Why is learning about history important? And particularly you're thinking around, we're talking about activism, we're talking about social change, we are talking about strategies for change. So why talk about something that happened 400 to 500 years ago? So I took a quote from an American philosopher, George Santayana, who has been misquoted, but the quote is, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And he was trying to make the point is that if we don't understand how things have happened before, we either keep those systems and structures in place, or we simply assume that's the way that they are always.
Do you think that disabled people have always been treated the same way in society? Do you think disabled people had less or more rights throughout history? Has anything changed in your opinion? Feedback from the group included. It was horrendous for disabled people in the past, and words like handicapped was used to describe disabled people. And I never realized that handicapped had a meaning and a cap in hand, and the understanding was that disabled people should beg for money on the streets. Institutional care, disabled people being locked up away from society, being left behind. Change has been slow. Ireland at one point had the most amount of people incarcerated than anywhere else. Public transport is still not for all the public. A lot of disabled people still can't use public transport, and some of us have to ring ahead to use buses and trains. Breton law was a good thing because it made a distinction between those with mental health difficulties and those with intellectual impairments. Lack of disabled people that represent the disability movement as we understand it. It would be good to have this representation being at the 100th year of the Shannon. Disabled people are still waiting and are being left behind. Those that need to listen are not listening. Why is there a lack of progress? Some disabled people have succeeded, while others have not. Rights are essential. Disability is a systemic issue. It has been slow, especially in the area of employment.
Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by going back into the 17th century just to look at where disabled people were located. Specifically, because of where we're located, Ireland obviously is a colony. I'm going to look at the British system because it would have governed Ireland as well. There are some similarities with other European jurisdictions, and then because of how European countries expanded and conquered and took over large parts, that some of those areas of law and classification became used in other countries, and they also became interlinked as well. The one thing I want to say is some of the conversation that we will have, and Fiona will say this as well, is distressing. There is no two ways about it. We are going to be talking about systems and structures that denied people of their freedom, of their choices, that were deeply undemocratic, that were often led to people's not only exclusion, but murder. So those are hard things to listen to. And also in the early part of my presentation, I'm going to use 2 or 3 terms that at the moment we certainly wouldn't use now, but they're actually legal terms back in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. Okay, so they're not terms that we would use now, but they had a specific legal and then later medical interpretation. So I just want to give that kind of warning in advance. Sometimes the conversation, we're actually looking back on, my God, how could systems have been constructed like that? But it's to bear in mind that that's what they were, systems that were designed and built, because that's the part that we want to look at. If systems can be designed, they can be undesigned as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about a thing called a hierarchy. And a hierarchy is a system that's all based on some people assuming that they are better or superior to others. And there sadly are many, many systems that exist in society and have been developed. They're usually based that classify and categorize people either on legal, and I'm going to start with the legal one, and then medical, and I'm using this in inverted commas, scientific principles, because they're not based on any kind of scientific principles at all. But the people, particularly in the 19th century, claimed that they had specific knowledge that allowed them to group people into categories together and make decisions about their lives. And these hierarchies would say that there are people at the top and they're there, and there are people out at the bottom. And those systems were used to exclude or deny people their rights. And we'll see, as a lot of people have mentioned around institutionalization and people have been denied their rights, it obviously has been used to make decisions about disabled people, but it also has been used to justify colonialism and imperialism. And I'll bring that up. And in fact, how disabled people were treated is very much linked with how Indigenous people were treated as European countries expanded across the globe in the late 18th, early 19th century, and began to subjugate and murder and expropriate the land of people across the world. And there's actually a strong link between how disabled people had their rights denied and systems that were used to justify colonialism. The idea that racism and disablism actually share ideas and beliefs is really, really important, because they reinforced each other. The systems that denied disabled people their lives were also used to justify the theft and murder of Indigenous people, but also that happened vice versa, as systems were put in place in Africa, in Asia, in South America, and North America. They were then imported back into Europe to actually further deny disabled people their rights. So in looking at this history, it's often quite grim, as myself and Fiona were saying at the start before you guys come on. There's a lot of this that isn't fun, but it is important precisely to recognize that a lot of the systems that we are still looking to dismantle have a historic point, because they were created by people, and people making decisions about who had choice, who could control, who could participate in society. So that concept of a hierarchy is something that's important to have an understanding of. One of we often mention in strategies for change resources, and I'm just screen sharing a cover of a book called Those They Called Idiots: The Idea of the Disabled Mind from the 1700s to the Present Day by Simon Jarrett, which both myself and Fiona read last year, but also books that are similar to that are actually trying to locate where we're at now with disabled people and their role in society. Was that always the case? And there's actually some really interesting points. I think this is the reason that we're talking this is systems been created and society's been structured. Part of us can make the assumption that the way things are now represents some kind of natural order, or that they were always like that. And that's why we're having this conversation within strategies for change around the history of disabled people. Because actually, the likes of Simon Jarrett and others say, well, that's not the case. He went back to looking at the 18th century and said that disability and capacity, there was no medical professionals, there were no scientists exploring disabled people, but it was mostly based on legal terms from the 16th century onwards, based on terms such as, and again, these are terms that we would use, would find morally offensive right now, such as idiots, lunatics, and imbeciles. And they were legal terms used in relation to courts of law, in relation to people's rights to own and sell property. And as Nicola mentioned from her group, there was these types of classifications existed in Brehon law, they existed in Roman and Greek laws as well, and they were mostly based on providing protections for people. They weren't based on excluding people, it was providing protections to ensure that people had the same rights as. What Simon Jarrett and others have shown in the 18th century is disabled people are intrinsically part of their own communities. They have families, they have jobs, and they have broader community supports. And one of the things that he looked at was court appearances, because they're nice written documents from the 1700s onwards. And when disabled people come before the dock, they're been judged not by lawyers or judges, by lay people who recognize their intrinsic value within society, who recognize that they have supports in the community. A lot of the conversations are around legal concepts to whether people could understand money or ownership of property. And at that point, we have a system called wards at the court, which we still hear conversations now because there's laws that still exist in Ireland from the 1840s. But the idea being that if people had resources, and this often meant quite wealthy people, and the king could look to confiscate their land or their castles or whatever, based on an understanding that they couldn't manage it themselves. Now, by and large, that was hugely resisted because people felt that if people had resources, whether rich or poor, they were theirs. And what Jarrett shows very extensively, that cultural works, stories, plays, jokes, and even cartoons really show the visibility of disabled people in society, not separate from. So we're not, it doesn't paint, the early 18th century as being an absolutely perfect land and milk and honey for disabled people. But it actually shows at that point a continuum that disabled people were very much in the community, having jobs, having families, playing roles. They were continually referenced within culture, often the butt of jokes, but as he made the point that everybody was the butt of jokes in the 18th century. And the presence of disabled people shows that they were actively involved in their communities. So actually in the 18th century, disabled people were by and large family members, they owned property, they had jobs, and were seen as valued members of the community. Now, there was a recognition of difference that was there. As Nicola had mentioned, that recognition of difference was recognized in other jurisdictions like Brehon law, Roman systems, and so on forth. So the recognition of difference was there, but people were part of the community. In the 19th century, things begin to change really, really rapidly. Now, not just for disabled people, but we're looking at rapid societal changes. There's changes in property laws, which forces a predominantly rural population off the land that they would have had collective ownership from. So everybody would have worked the land together. Communities would have had joint ownership through the commons, and people survived off the land. That was the primary way of. So huge changes, first in England, obviously that was transposed into Ireland as well, but across Europe as well, moving from a rural population to huge and rapid social transformation where people now had no jobs and moved to towns and cities, which for people who were in control of society, there's a movement towards managing and maintaining what they call social order, particularly in these rapidly growing cities where people don't have jobs, there's a huge amount of destitution, and a lot of question of people who are hungry, who don't have roofs over their heads, who don't have a role in society, been completely disenfranchised. So what you start to see in the 19th century from about 1815 onwards is the state actually taking a role in moving people into institutions. So you have laws like the Asylum Acts of 1815 and 1845, and the Poor Laws in 1834, which I know Fiona will mention again, is they lead to things like workhouses and county asylums. So that there's a sizable proportion of the population that 100 years prior to that, regardless of their impairment, the role of the community was to provide the supports they needed to live in the community, to this rapid social transformation where people don't have those community supports anymore. They're moved off the land into cities that are strange and completely different. And there's a total fracture of the supports that were there. And the state and the people in control are kind of very uneasy about these large numbers of people together and start to say, right, well, we need to, quote unquote, either look after them or put them in spaces. So when I was talking about in the 17th century, where we had those three terms that were being used, they were lay definitions, which were commonly accepted in society as labels. They were moved into legal discussions, which again said there were actually no lawyers at that point. It was people self-defended themselves or had members of the community defend them. And we start to see at this point in the 19th century to disabled people be discussed by medical professionals. So the doctors are now deciding what people's capacity are, or doctors are deciding what role people can play in society. And that later becomes into where you have anthropologists and biologists or race science starting to decide what capacity people had. So there's a huge amount of societal change that has a massive impact in how disabled people are viewed in society. And it's not just affecting all disabled people equally. So the research will show that there's a huge, what we call an intersection between class and impairment. So cases involving wealthy disabled people remain in the civil courts. So there's questions of where wealthy disabled people, whether or not somebody can inherit land, whether somebody is allowed to get married and own an estate. Those are those questions. Whereas for poorer disabled people who start to appear, they're in criminal courts. So it's where people are in urban environments where they've gone from a situation where previously community supports were put in place. They're now have the rise of institutions for punishment or separating people from society. Also linked with this, and I mentioned at the start, is you have the rise of colonialism and the rise of concepts of racial hierarchy. So this is the point in the 19th century where, as Europe expands and starts conquering violently large sections of the globe, they are encountering different cultures, religions, and belief systems. And to justify their domination and to justify claims to Indigenous peoples' lands, a lot of legal arguments are brought in to say, well, we're on the top and therefore what we take is right to us. And actually, really interestingly, many of those legal arguments that had begun to be introduced about denying disabled people their right to own property, or the right to disabled people to inherit land or to inherit money, or to actually exclude them from society based on the fact that they, quote unquote, lack the capacity. Those exact same arguments were used to justify depriving the liberty of Indigenous people across the globe. So that when Europeans were moving into South America and conquering and pillaging and absolutely razing societies to the ground, it was done on the basis that they used exact same legal arguments to say where these the disabled people lack the capacity to make decisions because of different cultures, religious belief systems. European colonialists said these people, and that's the term that would use, lack the capacity to make decisions, therefore they can't own land. So it's ours. I think the term that was used was terra nullius. It was unknown land. And those were genuinely legal arguments that were used to say, this is why we now own Australia. This is why we now own large swathes of South America. When I say we, obviously, Ireland has a good long history of this form of colonial expansion about deciding who gets to decide who owns what. And just in terms of the rise of scientific racism, Ireland was centrally located within that. There was a very famous book published in the mid-19th century by a Scottish anthropologist called Robert Knox, who published a book, and it was a bestseller. It's a bestseller all across England and across Europe, and it was called The Races of Man. And in that book, Knox puts the white European at the top of this kind of apex. And for him, race or hereditary descent is everything. It stamps the man. So this was the kind of thinking from the 19th century onwards. And it was based on conversations around disabled people about what people had the capacity to do, what people were born with, and making decisions on that. And just, I pulled a quote out of The Race of Man because he had a special hatred for the Irish, and Knox had broken down into one of the races, being the Celtic race, presented of two extremes of what is called civilized man. In Paris, we find the one, in Ireland at Skibbereen and Derrynane the other. Civilized man cannot sink lower than at Derrynane. And Robert Knox would have had at the bottom of the ladder for most of his conversations that the Irish were beyond redemption, that they were this lower form in racial hierarchy. So from the 19th into the 20th century, people were mentioning that around institutionalization, about disabled people having fewer and fewer rights. And historians call this the period of the Great Incarceration. it does. I know 200 years is a long time, but we go back 200 years. We go back into the early 18th century. Disabled people, remember, at that point, are part of the community. They have jobs, they have families, they have the right to own property. There are occasionally queries in civil cases around whether people have committed a crime and whether they should serve some punishment or whether they have the capacity to understand money. And by and large, what Jared and other people had shown was the community would rally around and say the supports are there and people remained in the community. From the 19th century onwards, we start seeing people being locked up. So you see prisons, you see workhouses, you see asylums. And there's the move towards compulsory institutionalization of people. And these are the terms that are used, who are judged helpless, dangerous, and vulnerable. And that category is left completely wide open. It is up to medical professionals who now decide who is deemed helpless, who is deemed dangerous, and who is deemed vulnerable. People who are poor or deemed to be quote unquote unfit for society were routinely removed from society and locked up. They had no rights. So a decision was made about who could participate in society. And a huge element driving this, strangely enough, was calls for universal rights in the mid-19th century, which led to a debate, particularly in England, about who could be classified as an active citizen. So after the French Revolution in 1848, there's hysteria in England, which translates into Ireland as well, about a large proportion of the population who lacked education. And then in the views of people ruling society, questions about lacking the capacity, and then whether they were poor and hungry, and also then obviously including people that they felt lacked either were dangerous or vulnerable. So a large conversation, strangely enough, about democratic rights led to even further incarceration of people in prisons and workhouses. And actually, over the course and into the 20th century, you start to see what is called the rise of eugenics. And this is a pseudo, and when I say pseudoscientific, it's complete nonsense, and we now know this, but an assumption that society needs to either promote some people to have more children, but more than often is prevent people from having children. And eugenics was limiting and controlling people's right to participate in society, which was linked to people being locked up, and also to stop people from having children, because a feeling from people who were controlling society, there needed to be, quote unquote, more people like them and less people who they would have to lock up in prisons and workhouses. You think sometimes there's an assumption that when we're talking about how people are excluded, that's somehow, not saying okay, but there are times we can internalize values and go, that's just the way society is structured, right? That is sometimes when people say, that's just the way society is. And to show the history going, that was created, that people made decisions and they built systems up. So it wasn't always the case. Like Nicola's group mentioned the Brehon laws, and we're just taking 17th century, 18th century England, and the same applied in Ireland as well, that disabled people were part of the community. That was the case. And then there was decisions made in terms of how society was transforming so rapidly, and it was based on money and power, and people now been seen as different and needing to be moved into institutions. And even at later stages, I know Fiona will talk this, where you have well-meaning charities to quote unquote look after people, but they're based on that assumption that people need to be separate from and locked away from. That wasn't always the case. So when we talk about that, it's important to recognize systems that can be built also can be dismantled. That's the really important part. Is it's not that they represent something that is natural or something the way it has to be. A system that is built by people can be dismantled by people. That's the important part. But Langdon Down, actually, we know him today as the man that gives us the term Dr. Down syndrome. But up until the 1950s, that was not the term that was used by anybody in the world. The term was used, and no one used it now for right reasons, was Mongolism. And what Downs was a virulent racist, and he thought you could classify human beings based on their ethnicity in a ladder of being. And he felt that there were physical characteristics between people who were found in Asia and people who had Down syndrome. And he had said, what this demonstrates is that this is clearly a quote unquote lower race. And we find that the people in Western Europe who are exhibiting this trait are actually exhibiting traits from ethnic groups that have not evolved. That's in his terminology. And that term existed up until the 1950s, until people from Mongolia lobbied the UN and said, this is grossly offensive. This is suggesting that we as people are somehow less than. So up until the 1950s, that was the term that was used. People now use the term, originally moved it into Dr. Down syndrome, and now we call Down syndrome. And the reason I was mentioning that is myself and Fiona were mentioning that an organization were going, today's the day we celebrate Dr. Down's birthday. And I was kind of going, I wonder, did they actually know who Dr. Down was and what he wrote and what he said about people? Because I don't think if they did, they'd be actually making those terms. So it just links how racial hierarchies and hierarchies based on impairment were absolutely welded together, because they were both about classifying people, removing their rights, making decisions about their lives, and also using completely nonsensical scientific or pseudoscientific terms to say who had a right to live, who had a right to have choices in their own lives. And that's what.
So Pauline Conway in her book talks about the architecture of confinement, and the first house of industry was built in Smithfield in Dublin, and it was to lock up the poor, the destitute, and the beggars. It was beside a deportation centre for women, and beside the first lunatic asylum in Great Gorman and the first fever hospital in Cork Street. So disability, as Damien talked about, was very connected and locked together with poverty. So those deemed disabled were also deemed poor, and this encouraged the public how to see and view disability as poor and destitute, but it wasn't related to their impairment. Good behavior in these institutions and industrial houses was rewarded with a badge for good behavior, so it was legally okay to beg on the streets if you wore this badge. And a lot of disabled people that might have had an absence of a leg or arm would be seen begging, and because they wore this badge. These houses of industries were set up to encourage people to stay out of them because they were more horrible places. So it encouraged people to work for themselves or to get a job or work the land or be a tradesman. And if you didn't have a job in them days, there was no social welfare payment. So all you could do is to enter one of these workhouses. So poor people, destitute people, disabled people of all kinds, and those with mental health issues. The Irish state had a very much hands-off approach to supporting disabled people. Those that were in workhouses were to go to other institutions that were new and they were run by the Catholic Church. And this was supported by the relief of the sick and the destitute poor. There was no outdoor relief, and this was part of the poor law at this time. Ireland built more institutions after 1920 and renamed its workhouses to county homes, and asylums were renamed as mental hospitals, and they were just not for the insane. Children with no parents ended up here. Disabled people of all kinds ended up here, so the blind, the deaf, those with epilepsy, and then those delirious with infection and syphilis ended up here. And those that were abandoned by their husbands were left here as well. 1923, we seen the introduction of a new law And this new law stated that if you were living in confinement, so if you were living in one of these institutions, you had no right to vote. This new law encouraged disabled people of all kinds to live apart from everyone else. They were presumed to be dependent on others, not allowed to have intimate relationships. They were kept separate so they couldn't have intimate relationships and have children, and this was part of the Lunacy Act. And we still have some of the Lunacy Act still present to this day in our laws. Hopefully it's going to change soon. Parents of disabled people were told to give up their disabled children, as it was best for the family to avoid any burden. Religious orders were put in charge, and these believed that disabled children were not compatible with family living. And by 1900 we had 278 workhouses and asylums, night and laundries, industrial schools, and so on. The parish system was created, so you could only get a service locally. You could not move from county to county and still get the same service. And we still have that today. Our new colonizers were the Catholic Church, and most of the new government at this time were Catholic. Lots and lots of different religious orders moved into Ireland, and these were not interested in looking after the mentally ill, so they were really, really happy with the state provision of asylums. These groups were also not very happy in working together. They were the main providers of support services to disabled people. Some of these religious orders included St. John of God's, and these came from Portugal. St. Vincent de Paul was from Paris. The Brothers in Charity were French, and the Daughters of Charity were founded by St. Vincent de Paul. So from 2022 to 1986, disabled people were really non-existent in the welfare state. In 1954, we seen the Health Board pay £1 to those that had acquired impairments during the Second World War. This was a small grant, and it was very strict, and it was means tested, and we still have means testing today. It was only in 1986 that we seen the government give a social welfare payment to disabled people that weren't working. This payment was called DPNA, Disabled Persons Maintenance Allowance, and today it's called Disability Allowance. But it's also strict criteria and means tested also. So the Industrial Revolution was an important part of the segregation of disabled people, because before this, lots of people, including men, women, children, and disabled people, worked from home and produced goods to make money and make a living. Examples were the weavers from the Liberty and those that worked the land. So in essence, the Industrial Revolution wiped out the integration of disabled people with the emergence of factories and workhouses, and disabled people were deemed unfit, unable to work, they were left isolated and really abandoned. In 1801, we seen the collapse of working from home. Households became separate from paid work. People went out to work, and it was the end of the domestic economy and the end of disabled people being part of the community and the community of work. The Industrial Revolution separated disabled people from non-disabled people. There was a view that disabled people were not fit to work and they needed to be cared for outside of the community. This perpetuated difference and the growth of the medical and charity model of disability. Social Darwinism and disabled people.
Between January and August 1941, 70,000 physically and mentally disabled people were murdered at the hands of the doctors of the Third Reich in gas chambers at 6 so-called clinics throughout Germany. One of those so-called clinics was here at Hadamar, where 10,000 people were killed.
The Nazis did, the mass killing of disabled people, because they were disabled and because they did not have a right to live and had no equal rights and were considered not human beings.
Concepts such as Darwinism were part of the background philosophy which led ultimately to the Nazi campaign to kill disabled people and the deaths at Hadamar. At the end of the 19th century, social Darwinism was a fashionable theory in academic circles. Theorists tried to apply the principles of development and survival of the fittest from nature to human society. It was thought that in the competition between quickly developing industrial societies, only the strong, the sane, those able to work should be allowed to live. In 1920, eminent scientists called for the killing of mentally ill people unable to work. Teresa de Gaynor is a disabled lawyer and campaigner who's written a book on the subject of euthanasia.
The most famous names are Binding and Hoche, who have written a book. They compare the costs or the productivity of a non-disabled person in society and of those who are disabled and need assistance or need care or whatever. But they also think a lot about high intense medical care, which is a very modern subject also. They talk about, is there a need to keep everyone at life, even if they need a lot of help?
So on whose philosophy did the National Socialists base their mass killing policy?
Well, I think Benning and Hoche helped a lot. Benning and Hoche talked a lot about the folk, the people. There was this idea that the German folk and Volkskörper needs to be healthy, non-disabled, very strong, to be the best people in the world. And this is what the Nazis based their program on.
The majority of institutions were surrounded by 4 high walls. They were also on the outskirts of the community. They were very unclean, and it was very easy to catch a disease. They were toxic environments. The psychiatric approach to care prevailed, and sadly, an awful lot of people were medicated, and this was a form of control. Discipline and routine was high on the agenda, and people that lived here believed they were locked up for life, and the medical profession were in charge. In the 1930s, we seen a rapid growth of specialised schools for disabled people as part of the existing support. And these were for both children and adults. And those that lived in other institutions and needed schooling and were labelled disabled were transferred to these schools in large numbers, and they were open to medical inquiry.
At school, children with disabilities faced an even more difficult and frustrating time. Often there was no recognition of the fact that they even had a disability. Marie Hager's increasing deafness forced her to rely on guesswork and her basic self-taught lip reading to get by at Crowland Road School in Tottenham, where she was a pupil in the 1930s.
Oh, it's exactly the same. Nothing's changed. Oh dear, I can feel the sense of loneliness, the isolation, the rejections, and the trouble I was in, all because I was deaf. The secret that I tried to keep for so long had to emerge, I suppose, in the end. But the secret that I once kept, I don't know why. Because no one could help. I suppose that's why. And it hasn't changed. I can feel it. It's like an aura all around me. The isolation, in spite of the fact that it was packed with children. Teachers, children, headmistresses, and I was still alone. Totally alone. Is my problem. It wouldn't go away. It couldn't go away, in fact. That I wanted so much to reject and throw away, I couldn't. The lump in my throat is back again now. I can see and visualise myself back here, sitting on the floor with legs folded, arms folded, listening to, I'm supposed to be listening to. I don't know what. I didn't know then and I don't know now.
Tell me the names of 6 towns.
Teacher would just dismiss me. Whatever I'd said, if it was wrong, she'd just dismiss me. She probably couldn't cope with it anyway. And she didn't know that I was deaf after all. It hadn't come to light, not then. So she probably thought, not too bright. Not very bright at all. And you know, to this day, I'd rather preferred they thought I was not so bright, rather than they thought the truth, that I was deaf.
Before the last war, around 100,000 disabled children were brought up in institutions. Some were written off as mental defectives and sent to mental handicap hospitals. The majority, though, were officially classified as blind, deaf or crippled, and were placed in institutions segregated according to their disability. Mary Baker was born in Woodlands, Dorset in 1922. From birth, she had a dislocated hip, which led to severe problems in walking. At the age of 10, her mother died, and the authorities sent her away from her father and brothers to be brought up at the Hallowick Home for Crippled Girls in North London.
When I came in through the gates, it was very difficult for me. Had no idea what I was going to do and what the place was like. But it was huge and it was lonely. And as I entered a different life.
Evelyn King was born in Wiltshire in 1945. She had cerebral palsy, which meant she had great difficulty in speaking. This communication problem was interpreted by the authorities as severe mental disability. At the age of 5, she was sent to a mental handicap hospital, officially classified as an imbecile.
I used to dream about the poor mum and dad, you know. I never used to go home. I used to miss all that. Never seen home in my life. But every time my mother and father used to come at the afternoon, I was happy then. Brothers and sisters didn't used to allow to come in the villa. They only could look through the windows. But I used to wait for them through the window but they wouldn't let them come inside. Couldn't do anything, go out or anything, stay inside all the time.
The children were not allowed to go out to school. Instead, they were given a narrow, segregated education within the institution. The schooling given to so-called crippled children was often very basic.
We didn't have the education that we should have had. It was very primitive. It wasn't suitable, really. So even if we had a good brain, we were mental, so to speak. Even if our bodies were bad, so our minds were meant to be the same. The main thing was the religion, because it was a Church of England school. And we went to church 3-4 times a day. I didn't think we should have had all that religion, but we had to have it. And so we accepted it. It was something we had to accept.
What is the picture about?
Oh,
Helma, come and write it.
Children in schools for the deaf had to accept that sign language, the natural language of the deaf, was banned in the classroom. Teachers insisted on the oral method of communication.
Tell me what it is about.
Good,
Go and sit down.
I gradually settled down in school and made friends, and I didn't feel quite so lonely then. And I did pick up learning signing from the other children in the school, and one of my friends was Dennis. When I first came to the school, the children couldn't sign. But because my brothers and sisters were all deaf, I learnt the signing from them. And when I came to the school, I taught children, the boys I would show them the signs for cow, horse, pigs, pussycats, any animals. And they were really interested, and they wanted to learn more. When we were in the classroom, we would secretly sign when the teacher had his back to us. He would be writing on the blackboard. And if the teacher did catch us signing, he would wag his finger and tell us off, say signing isn't allowed, it's against the rules.
With the growth of TV in the 40s and 50s, we seen the Irish government build TB hospitals, one of which is Peamount, which we know very well today. The idea was that people that had TB would go to these hospitals and that they would live there and work there. So they were like a colony, a self-sufficient colony. And the plan was to roll out these hospitals around the country, but sadly this didn't happen. And Peamount Hospital today is a residential support service for those with intellectual impairments. In the 1950s, we seen the growth of parents and friends associations, and these associations set up day services and day centres for disabled people to go to because they were deemed unable to work. And these charity organisations were big into fundraising. And the idea that good non-disabled people should feel pity for disabled people, and disability was seen as a tragedy. The psychiatric and medical handicap nursing and other lay people became prominent within these institutions. There was a belief that disabled people and those with mental handicaps will greatly benefit from psychiatric care and other medical professionals. Catholic nursing became very prominent and was taught in many of these institutions. 1965, we've seen a fundamental shift in how disability support services were run. This was a result of a report commissioned by the Department of Health, and it clearly stated that disabled people were very poorly treated. Standards of care were high on the agenda, but this report also highlighted the fact that those disabled people receiving community care had a better quality of life than those living in institutional care, and the state needed to take more responsibility. Many other reports, mainly from the UK, highlighted also the substandard care and support disabled people experienced in these institutionalized settings. Disability is a very, very prosperous industry, and some of the top services include the Rehab Group, St. Michael's House, Cope Foundation, the IWA, Enable Ireland, and Rehab Care. 2011, for example, the Rehab Group made 176 million. St. Michael's House made 87 million. Cope Foundation made 62 million. The IWA made 53 million. And in 2020, St. John and Gauls made 34 million and only spent 6% on day services. And then we've seen the financial scandals of rehab, the CRC, St. John and Gauls, and I could mention lots more. And then on top of this, we have heard many stories over the years about disabled people being abused in these institutions. Financial abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and emotional abuse. So from our history, we know that we are really good at locking people up. We also know that we have a passive tolerance to the confinement of disabled people. From the 1980s onwards, we've seen disabled people globally, collectively campaigning for the rights to live like everyone else and have the same life chances as their non-disabled counterparts. This movement turned the provision of exclusionary practices and services upside down. Disabled people took back control and insisted on the right to independent living as opposed to specialized services and institutional care. But be very mindful that we have still a lot of work to do as activists.